Hey everyone, today on Big Al Books, I'm here to do my October wrap-up. It was quite a magical reading month for me, and I've got about 12 books to talk about, and I was just inspired to read this month. There was Victober, so I've got some Victorian classics to talk about. I've got some creepy books that I read for Halloween, and also at the start of the month, we had Canadian Thanksgiving, so I had a long weekend off where I tried to read as much Canadian fiction as I could. So I think that is where I'm going to start with this video. The first book that I picked up this month was Washington Black by S.E. Edugyan. This was a book I was kind of on the fence about picking up, but then it started showing up on quite a few shortlists for book prizes. The hardcover went on sale, and also the Canadian edition has a cute octopus on the cover, so I was swayed into picking it up, and I'm glad that I did because this was quite enjoyable. This is a story about a runaway slave, so it can be quite heavy at times, and it deals with these heavy topics like racism and slavery in the past, but at the same time there's something that is very refreshing and fast-paced and adventurous about this book. So it was a very unique take on the slave narrative. So I'm glad that I checked it out. Our main character, Washington, starts off as a slave on a sugar plantation in Barbados, but then one of the British plantation owners starts to notice that Washington has this incredible artistic aptitude and he's got a very scientific mind. So he takes Washington on as an apprentice, and they eventually have to escape the plantation. Hence, Washington is on the run for most of this novel. And there is some serious globe-trotting going on in this book. They travel all around the planet together. We are taken to the far reaches of the Arctic. We go to Nova Scotia and Amsterdam and Morocco. So it was cool to see all of those locations as they would have been in the past, but I also found myself growing tired of the constant jet setting by the end of this book. I think it is appropriate though, since there are characters in this book who are running away from their past and trying to reinvent themselves and trying to find a sense of home, even if it's not necessarily in the place where they're living. So I think the constant shift in location was appropriate, but it was just kind of tiresome over the course of a book. I was also interested in the questions about race in this book and what it means to be a good white person in this time period, because there are characters that you think are helping out Washington, so you think that they must be good people, but at the same time then you find out that some white people are really only concerned about slavery as this kind of abstract moral dilemma, and they believe that slavery is a problem because it's some kind of moral blemish on white people. It's some kind of reflection that makes them look like bad people because of what they're doing, and they care more about that image than they actually care about the daily realities of slavery and how that affects Black people. So that was kind of something that's a little messed up. So you have to start wondering who are actually like good white people in this novel. So I think that this novel is asking some interesting questions, but still providing you with a fast-paced, fun narrative. So I'm really glad that I checked this one out. Though it did not win the Man Booker Prize, it is still in the running for the Giller Prize, which is the big Canadian prize for fiction, so I will definitely be rooting for Washington Black to take that prize home. The next Canadian book that I read over the Thanksgiving weekend was Brother by David Chariandy. This is one of those books that is very quiet, but quite powerful. So it's one of those books that's a slow burner, and there's not really a lot that's happening, but it still affects you kind of deep down in ways that you don't always realize, since this is a haunting portrayal of loss. Since this is about a family who loses one of their sons. So you kind of get the story in the past about how this young man came to die, but also there are scenes set in the present where we see how this loss is affecting his family and also his community. This is a book that's centered around a community in Scarborough, which is a neighborhood in the East End of Toronto, and this book explores the vibrancy of that community where there are so many different cultures and families that have immigrated from all these different places, but there are also challenges where families are dealing with poverty or mothers that have to work long hours to support their families, and You see scenes with police brutality or violence in the neighborhood. This novel also explores masculinity and how young black men are expected to perform this certain attitude of toughness. And the two brothers in this book kind of have different approaches for how they do that. But I really liked the narrator at the center of the story. He's kind of nerdy and he's not as good as coming across as a tough guy as his brother. So there's a scene where he talks about trying to fit in. But if I tried to worm my way into their circle, saying sup or maybe agreeing too eagerly on any manner, yeah, homeboy is indubitably dope, there'd be a difficult moment of silence. So it kind of explores that idea of like how you're supposed to perform an identity and how that can be kind of difficult. Another thing that impressed me with this novel is how it felt so subtle and there seemed to be so much subtext. Like there was so much that these characters weren't saying to each other. Maybe because they feel like they have to perform this masculine toughness that they can't express their emotions. So you're often left wondering how these characters are really feeling. And I feel like in the hands of a lesser novelist, this book could be really over the top and melodramatic since there are some intense things that happen in this book, but it's really not about that. It's not about taking the obvious route with this story, and it does leave more to the imagination where you have to figure out what's happening on your own. So there's just something really intriguing about this book and something very masterful about how this story has been told in such a subdued yet compelling manner. So I was quite impressed with this book, and I think that David Chariandy is quite a refreshing voice in Canlit, so I'll be looking forward to seeing what he does next. Next, I read a collection of short stories called Godless but Loyal to Heaven by Richard Van Camp, who is from the Dogrib First Nation in the Northwest Territories. Richard Van Camp often sets his fiction in the same town, Fort Smith, so you do start to see the same characters pop up again and again the more of his fiction that you read, so I find that kind of rewarding, and it's just like a weird crew of characters. So that's what I like about these stories. You know, they explore some of the heavy issues facing this community, like you've got addiction and sexual abuse and poverty and all of that. But at the same time, you've got these kick-ass characters who are taking matters into their own hands and using samurai swords and weird martial arts, and they're taking down shape-shifting monsters, and all sorts of wild stuff happens in these stories. So I like how Van Camp can kind of shift in between fantastical and realist in kind of like the blink of an eye. So he's just kind of a fun storyteller. I don't always love his writing style, but he's such a good storyteller that I just always want to keep turning the pages and seeing what's going to happen next in his stories. So glad that I checked this one out. The last book that I read during my Canadian Thanksgiving weekend was a graphic novel called Skim by Mariko Tamaki and Jillian Tamaki. This is one of those graphic novels that really doesn't have much of a plot. There really isn't a lot happening, but it's about the day-to-day life of a teenage girl, and this book is really just about the difficulties of being a teenager with those intense hormonal shifts that you experience, where you go through all these ups and downs, and it's just kind of a difficult, crappy time of your life. So I feel like this book honors that and really doesn't try to trivialize what this character is going through. And Kim is just a cool character to follow along. She's a bit of an outsider. She doesn't really connect with a lot of the people around her. She's experimenting with becoming a witch, so that was kind of appropriate for an October Halloween read, but she's really just trying to gain a sense of her identity and who she is and what she wants. So this was just like a quiet graphic novel. I don't think that it had much that was like crazy profound in it, but I still thought that it was a compelling reflection on a difficult stage of life. Another graphic novel that I read this month was volume 9 of Saga. I won't say too much about this one since it's like the 9th volume in a series, but I will say that for most of the time while I was reading this, I was like enjoying myself, I was having a good time, and then all this like crazy intense stuff happens in the last quarter of the book, and I thought that everything would hit me a lot harder emotionally than it did, so I didn't really like how these scenes went down. So I kind of didn't enjoy this one as much as I was expecting to, but I'm still just happy to get any Saga in my life, and I've heard that the creators are on hiatus now, so it might be a while till we get the next one. So like, I enjoyed reading this one, but I just would have expected a lot more, especially considering all the major things that went down in this volume. Moving along to Victober, I was able to read 2 Victorian novels this month, and I immensely enjoyed both of them. The first one was The Odd Woman by George Gissing. Now, I was expecting to like this one since I knew it was going to be about spinsters, and I am all about that life, but I enjoyed this one so much more than I was expecting to, and I think that this is one of my favorite Victorian classics at the moment. Like, first of all, I just found this really enjoyable on just a plot level. Like, it has all of those fun Victorian twists and all these intense relationships developing among the characters. Like, it was just a lot of fun, and there were characters that were just making disastrous decisions, but also I was really interested in the message of this book and how it explores the role of women at this time period, the turn of the century. And apparently George Gissing was like not great in his personal life, and he like didn't really care for women, and he wasn't very nice to them. But yet the women that he writes about in this book are just like very fleshed out human beings. When I went into this book, I thought odd in the title referred to these women who don't get married as kind of like strange or unusual, but actually odd refers to odd numbers, where at the time there were just more women being born in England, so that there just statistically weren't enough males for each woman to find a partner in marriage. So the ones who got left behind were considered these odd women, and for a lot of them this was kind of some kind of like sentence of doom, where if you didn't have a man, you were just never going to make it, you're going to live in poverty and misery for your whole life, and that's really unfortunate. In this book there are 2 women who dedicate their lives towards supporting younger women and teaching them the skills that they need to become valuable assets in the workplace. So they're really trying to change things for women so that they can be strong and independent on their own, even if they are not able to get married. Now, of course, their feminism isn't perfect, and they say strange things, like intersectionality was not a thing as much as it is now, where one of the women is like openly dismissive of lower class women, where she's saying like, I can't help those people, they're on their own. So like, she doesn't want to help poor girls, just kind of like the middle class ones. And then one of the other women is kind of like cheering on this man who like encourages smacking women when they're being dumb. So, you know, it's not contemporary feminism, of course, but it is fascinating to see what people thought at this time about these changes in society. This was just like a really fascinating book on a societal level and on a plot level. There were just some really heart-wrenching moments where the characters have to deal with some bitter disappointments of life. Also, one of the women in this book is a female alcoholic, which I had never seen portrayed in a Victorian novel, so it was neat to see this social issue from kind of a different stance than usual. So I just really love this book. It's one of my new favorite Victorian classics, and I am so glad that I checked it out this Victober. The second Victorian classic that I read was a reread for me, and that was The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Now, I talked about this book in a video I made last year called My 5 Least Favorite Victorian Classics, and I feel like I need to retract everything that I said in this video because I totally enjoyed this book the second time around. It was such a different reading experience. I had a blast reading this book, so I was just totally wrong on this one. Now, it had been 8 years since I have read this one, so like a lot has changed in those 8 years, and I've definitely read a lot more classics, but I think the major difference was I knew what to expect going into this book the second time around. So I think the first time I was kind of disappointed because I thought that it was going to be really dark, and because I knew Dorian was going to be like debaucherous, and I thought that that was going to be explored in more detail. But now I kind of get that like you can't really do that in a Victorian novel, and that this book, even how kind of tame it seems from a modern level, was like quite scandalous in its time, and Oscar Wilde didn't tone things down enough almost. So I could just appreciate it more, and I feel like I understood it on a deeper level this time around when it wasn't as focused on the plot and what was going to happen. Also, Oscar Wilde's wit, I feel like I appreciate a little bit more. The first time that I read this, I found Lord Henry to be like a really tiresome character because he's trying to be witty all the time, and while I still sort of get that he can become tedious, I was much more fascinated with his character. And I also have to appreciate how Oscar Wilde is this Irishman that is just throwing all these jabs at Victorian England, so you kind of have to respect that. Like, he is just roasting British society, and I am there for that. So I really appreciated the humor a lot more, and and the social commentary and just the descriptive writing. Some of the characters really believe that the senses are the way to heal the soul, and that's kind of why we're here on life, to like enjoy ourselves and to take pleasure in sensory experiences. So I feel like there were a lot of scenes that really incorporated all of the senses, whether it's sitting in a garden on a summer's day, or when Dorian would go to like low-class neighborhoods and they were just the sketchiest places ever, like these sketchy parts of London at night with the fog consuming everyone and the sketchy people out that were described as like twisted figures creeping around in the dark. I loved all of those passages. So I don't know what to tell you. I absolutely loved this book. It is no longer one of my least favorite Victorian classics, but now is probably one of my most favorite Victorian classics. I just had a lot of fun reading it. Really appreciate this novel, and it made me think a lot. So happy that I gave this one a second chance. This video is already way too long, but I still have some creepy books that I read for Halloween. So the first one I read was The Honey Farm by Harriet Alida. I think this is also a Canadian book, and it was pitched to me as a gothic novel set on a bee farm, so I was there for that, but this book was kind of a huge disappointment. It does build a lot of suspense, but it just doesn't build to anything impressive, so this novel was really forgettable most of the time, and I feel like it was very much like a debut novel, and there was just a lot of awkward writing, and I just didn't feel like I could really trust the author. So like there were some passages, like this is how one of the characters is introduced. Meeting her for the first time, you might be reminded of a tidy, highly polished operating theater. So like, I don't really know how a person is supposed to be like an operating theater, like the room, so that was kind of weird. Also, one of the characters' nipples are described as being like light switches that were flipped on. So, I don't know, there were just some questionable passages in here, so I just didn't get on with the writing style, and I did not care for what this story built up to, so this was a pretty forgettable book for me. Next, I read a collection of graphic short stories called Through the Woods by Emily Carroll. Just realizing this now. She's another Canadian author. So much Canlit this month. So the artwork in this collection is really stunning. There's a lot of like bold designs, some real striking colors in here, but to me the stories in here did not get me on a scary level, so that was kind of a disappointment. You know, I wanted to read these to get really creeped out, and that just didn't happen in any of these stories, so none of them were really memorable for me. So even though I enjoyed them kind of at the time while I was reading them, nothing made much of a lasting impression on me. So this is the kind of book like I'm glad I checked it out from the library, because it was fun to flip through on Halloween, but didn't really become very memorable or super creepy for me. The next collection of short stories that I read definitely had its scary moments, though. That was Songs of a Dead Dreamer by Thomas Ligotti. This is a Penguin Classics bind-up of his first collection of short stories, and I only got around to reading the first one, so I didn't finish the whole thing in October, but I did read his first collection, Songs of a Dead Dreamer, and yeah, it is one heck of a debut collection. There are some like really creepy stories in here. Thomas Ligotti, I read a collection of his last year, so I wanted to delve back into his work since I think that he has like a really strange and twisted mind. Yeah, that happened again. He writes supernatural horror, as he calls it, where really it's not like about like vampires or ghosts as much as it is about the like meaninglessness of the universe and kind of like the absurdity of being a human. That's kind of where the horror comes from, like being these like alienated little nobodies on a cosmic level. So like I find that kind of stuff terrifying too. So like his work just kind of freaks me out a lot. Not all of the stories in this collection worked for me. Thomas Ligotti is very prosy, so some of these stories just had like too much description and they were kind of tedious to get through, but there were a few in this collection that really got to me. One of them was called The Frolic, and it's about a man who works as a psychiatrist at a prison, and he's dealing with this very violent psychopathic man who murders children, and he gets this very unsettling feeling about his job and wanting to move away from this town, and then he starts to have some concerns about the safety of his own daughter, and that one was like legitimately freaky. Also, there is a story in here called Notes on the Writing of Horror, a story. So it's about an author who's like struggling to write a story, so he's kind of describing the process of writing the story and the different routes that he can take with it, while at the same time the writing of the story becomes its own kind of horror story. So it was just like really meta and fascinating, and it was creative, and it was just one of the best short stories that I've ever read. So there were some kind of dull moments in this, but there were also some real high points. So I'm excited to continue in November with the second collection in this book, Grimscribe. Lastly, I was able to listen to 2 audiobooks this month on my drives to and from work. The first one is a humorous collection of essays by Samantha Irby called We Are Never Meeting in Real Life. Her essays are very casual. She writes these internet-style blog posts, so like very funny, self-deprecating, entertaining, but I also find that it's best consumed in small doses, because both times with her essay collections I grow very tired of her sense of humor and her kind of stories by the end of the collection. Like, it's just like very repetitive and kind of one note sometimes. So I just find myself kind of getting frustrated with Samantha by the end of her collection. So I would recommend taking her in like slow, small doses and not trying to burn through one of these collections quickly. I also listened to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum, the children's classic that inspired the iconic film. I wanted to check out this book since the school where I'm at is putting on a musical of Wizard of Oz later this month, and I am playing oboe in the pit band, so I wanted to check out the story since I'm kind of in a Wizard of Oz mood. And I have to say, I really don't recommend this one. I don't think that reading the original adds much. Like, I know it's not fair to compare this book to the film version that did come afterwards, but like the film version just blows this thing out of the water. It just made the story so much more visual and profound. So like the book is just like really basic. The writing is dull and very simplistic, and all the scenes that were cut from the book were cut for good reason, because they're just very boring. The next time that I feel like experiencing this story, I will definitely stick with the film version. So apologies, Frank Baum, but I was not feeling this one. So that's it for all the books that I read this October. A pretty solid reading month for me. I'd love to continue chatting in the comments, so please let me know if you have thoughts on any of these books, or if you read anything cool for Victober or anything creepy for Halloween. I would love to hear about that. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.